Thank you everyone for joining us and for staying in the room for this session. As Jonathan said, my name is Mehreen Khan. I recently just joined the Times as economics editor, and before that was in Brussels up until last month for about 4.5 years, covering the EU, which also meant covering Brexit and the politics around the EU and UK's relationship. And as I told the panelists just a couple of minutes ago in the green room, I told one of my friends in Brussels that I was doing this, and their response was, so people still talk about Brexit in the UK, which was a reflection of some of the asymmetry of interest in what Brexit will come to mean, and what it was when the history books are written. There's definitely a sense in which I think the European Union are much don't really want to talk about it and don't really like to be reminded of the fact. So it's nice to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to two wonderful speakers. They are going to be having two presentations on what I think I would describe as sometimes the UK's much unloved services sector, but why it's so important for the economy and what it means, and some of the gaps that exist in the TCA and the post-Brexit relationship. We're going to start with June Du. June Du is a professor of economics at Aston University, and I think very recently she did a very in-depth study about the changing nature of UK services going up to between 2016 and 2019. June, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick us off with the presentation. As always, questions via Slido, I can see them, and hopefully we'll be able to incorporate them during the discussion once the presentations are done. So June, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehreen. Thank you, Mehreen. Okay, I can be heard. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is June Du. I'm going to talk to you about Brexit and services trade. I'm based in Aston University. There's wrong spelling on the last slides. It's University in Birmingham. I'm center director of a newly established center of business prosperity. One of the key themes of our research is how to make UK a more effective trader. So the title suggests new evidence from a synthetic difference in difference approach. I'll come to that. It is 6 months old. So in the kind of nowadays, the research rolling so fast, probably it's not that new anymore. But nevertheless, let me have a go. And this is a work with my collaborator, Sasha, in Aston. So I'm going to cover a couple of things. One is I will give a kind of motivation. I don't think we need much motivation, but nevertheless, I think there are some facts that's necessary to be laid at the table, simply because they're relevant, and you will see why. And I will make a case for services trade, which probably is not a difficult case to make. But through that, I hope to remind us that not only the service sector is 80%, but actually it has far-reaching impact in the economy. And I will very briefly come down to the technical side to explain what is the research question, how we kind of looked for the answer, and the kind of findings we have, and discuss what we discovered. And now I will offer a few slides, which is not from this paper, but nevertheless, throw the stone in a quiet river, and hopefully to raise the questions that we'll be looking at and discuss in the near future. Now, the problem is Brexit. Clearly, that's why we're all here. Why is that a problem? I think there are three things I would like to say. Number one is that since maybe even before 2016, this Brexit has come to our life, and we all talk about it. And there's more talked about during this 4.5 years uncertainty on goods and much more than services. I think in UK and Changing Europe, there have been a lot of discussions by experts like Sarah, like Jill, and others to speculate why there were so little discussion on services compared to trade. And I think there are different kind of arguments which make sense. Some suggest that that's simply because there's, a long distance between what UK wanted and what EU wanted, and some suggest that because this doesn't really hit the headlines like fish and lobsters, and some believe that these sectors probably would be taken care of by themselves and think the problem will resolve. And I think it's because of lack of education in the public, and it's not really understood what would be that implication. And hopefully by looking back, we can actually learn lessons from it. So these headlines are in the gazillions kind of headlines talking about what we will be expecting to see after the real Brexit. But nevertheless, I don't think it made much difference in the kind of making of the TCA. I regularly speak with policymakers, and one of my DIT friends told me, I think you should take Brexit out of any titles of your papers, simply because in no time they would stop wanting to referring your publications to anyone else, because it's not a discussion really welcomed. And I also got questions asked from the kind of pundit, asking, what is the point of looking back? Since now we already Brexited, we should look forward and see what's outside the EU. I think my response were essentially a couple. One is that I think it's really important to look back, because that's where you can understand where we fall down. And if you don't know where you fall down, you simply cannot pick yourself up. And second, I think it's all about laying down the facts on the table to understand not only the impacts in terms of quantifiable way, but also to understand the mechanisms of why this problem happened in order to identify what could be done. And second of all, as I will show you some pictures, I think the cost of Brexit and benefit of Brexit is far more than just the direct traders. It is spillovers, it's linkages in the whole economy, it's services and manufacturing, which in the age of servitization, services is just part of the competitiveness of manufacturing. It is all the regions, all the sectors. It is the sandwich maker and hairdressers. It is the coffee servers for those sectors which are more linked and open to the world economy. So it is just far too important than just 80% as a number. But nevertheless, I think, as you can see here, no matter you look left or right, in terms of number of the firms, the number of jobs, the turnover, value added, services economy just very big. So this is based on the data linked at the individual firm level from 2008 to 2017, and whatever you look at is just very significant as a sector. Sarah has produced the figure on the left. I think it's very brilliant and tell us how much the service sectors in the UK is relying on EU. The trade, in terms of the trade over GDP figure of UK is very similar with France, but you can see the differences in terms of reliance and dependence on the EU. UK is by far more than France, and we don't need to look down to Germany, and it's even less so. On your right-hand side, this is again at the firm level a statistics which shows you for specific type of services and how much these firms exporting, relying on EU customers and importing from EU customers. As you can see on the yellow side, they are exports to the EU. The blue colored bars are importing from the EU. As you can see, they are all significant. The EU market is by far the most important. And also, I would like you to see over time, some sectors actually growing quite fast up to the Brexit, real Brexit to 2020. And next, I think this might be slightly complicated, just let me explain. So this shows you where in the UK exports, what kind of services, by what kind of firms, to where. So if you could look at the top ones, that's a big chunk of services exported by companies in London, and what kind of services they are exporting by large or small companies and to which market. So I think a couple of things which emerge from this picture is that London is of course, very big, but it's not just London. It is not just the professional services and business services, and it's certainly not just the financial services. It's all sorts of services. And it's not just done by very large companies. Actually, a significant chunk of exports are done by small companies. And it's not just it's for the EU. I think in terms of market destination, it's very clear. EU is by far the most important. So I guess this tells you, in terms of regional spread, the services is really impacting on all sorts, all areas, and through all kinds of services types. And I think one point that I forgot to mention in the last one is, don't forget the services and FDI are very much linked. And if you look at the percentage of firms which multinational coming to the UK to invest, many of them are services. So the service trade is really, the conditions of doing service trade is really a huge consideration of FDI coming to the UK. So that's why one of the key considerations is that what is the kind of value proposition of UK after the Brexit? And that might change, and I will show you some statistics towards the end. Now, coming to this particular paper, the paper is already on the UK and Changing Europe website. I think for people who are interested in the topic, probably had already had a look, so I will just run through very quickly. The key research question here is, because of Brexit referendum in 2016, up to 2019, where the most recent data is available, what has happened to it? Has it had a loss? Who had a loss? Who seemed to win? Which sector? What type of services? And which market? So these are the kind of questions we're looking for. Service data Apache, and there's a whole lot of discussions to discuss, what is the better data. There's no perfect data. There's better data. So what data we're using here is OECD WTO harmonized and made consistent. It is between 2005 to 2019 for 202 countries for 12 types of services. Now, all sorts of similar studies which talk about the impact of Brexit is really to measure the counterfactual, which we do not observe. The quality of any kind of analysis like this really depending on the ability to identify the causal effect. And as you can imagine, if you want to estimate someone who smokes and the health impact of smoking, you have to find someone just like him, which identical with everything else but didn't smoke. In this case, exactly the same. So there are three popular methods to estimate this: and difference in difference, synthetic control, and what we use, the synthetic difference in difference. In a nutshell, difference in difference essentially just to eliminate control for everything else the same. If you find something which you can capture by finding the difference before and after a structure break like this, it's an intervention, then you can claim that is the causal impact. The problem of difference in difference method in this case is that we have only one treated unit, which is UK. And you have to depend on to find a parallel trend. So if, for example, before 2016, the trend of UK is already different from others, then difference in difference wouldn't tell you, how much of it, because there are a lot of confounding factors. Now we'll come to the synthetic control, which is by far the most popular methods, which essentially is a matching of units and difference in difference, which is okay, it's very popular, but then nevertheless, you would have some limitations of identifying what would be similar and to find a synthetic UK for you to compare. And also, we have a problem with calculating the inference. So that is why we have adopted this synthetic difference in difference, which is based on the research from Arkin, Sky, and Imbens. So Imbens is the person who got Nobel Prize for similar approach to identify causal impact in 2021. This is one of the founding paper of his award. So this method allows us to build the synthetic UK flexibly, drawing similar units from the pool of controlling, but allowing us to flexibly weighting the periods and units. So in a nutshell, we believe this is probably the best method, the most consistent and most robust and efficient. So using this method, we have tried loads of robustness tests I will not bore you with, and this is what we found. Okay, let me start with, sorry. How to go back? I told you all the secret, that's no good. So where are the rest of the lines? Well, this picture has a lot of lines. So the one you see is UK, but then, I would like to imagine a lot of lines at the back. And I was about to say that, look, this is the service performance, service export performance of UK among other peers. As you know, the UK is largest, second largest service exporters after US, and you will see that up to 2014, the growth rate of UK services are similar. You must be able to see that. Now, between 14 to 16, and you will see that there's a slowing trend shared with many others. There's no difference. And then after 16, you'll be shocked to see that UK is recovering, but in a much slower pace. And here you will see a great divergence between the growth of UK with others. And towards the end, UK has raced to the bottom. So you must be very impressed. And here is why we want to look at it and trying to identify how much of it is because of Brexit. Okay, this is what we found. The upper panel and the lower panel are essentially the same thing. So using color code, you will see the red basically is the loss or reduction in service exports because of Brexit using our synthetic difference in difference methods. And the blue ones are gains. So we kind of, gave the title of winners and losers of Brexit. So it's essentially using this method to identify what has happened to it. And overall, what we found is because of Brexit referendum 2016, and we did play with all sorts of robustness tests, including moving the 2016 timeline to 2015 and trying different pool and trying different time frame, and as well as trying different components to calculate synthetic UK, we find more or less the same results. So overall, UK service export has declined by about 18.5. Let me go to the next slide to remember. Yeah, 18.5 billion pounds year on year, which is quite a huge number. We find that Ireland, among all European countries, has actually gained from this. And the statistics is about 30 billion US dollar, 24 billion pounds year on year, which is about 14.8%. And the UK loss is about 5.7%. This is less than the estimates provided by other places, including the UK TPO, and some colleagues in Loughborough, they use synthetic control. So the estimates are ranging between 7% to about 9%. And here, using these methods, we find it's less. But nevertheless, 5.7% drop year on year is a massive number. And we find that not all the sectors were impacted equally. We find transport, travel were by far the most impacted sectors, and insurance has lost. Telecom has also declined. So these are statistically significant estimates. At the same time, European countries do not overall win apart from Ireland, but some countries did have some gain. So for example, we find in the transport service, the UK has lost grounds, Germany and Spain have gained grounds. And the travel services seem to be kind of compensated by the gains in Spain. And we find, for example, the insurance loss for the UK, Germany has shown 10% up, and Switzerland has gained about 6%. And we find, for example, the business services, Ireland has grown about 18% up, and the other winner is Netherlands. Okay, so, and I think it's worth mentioning that overall, we did not find significant reduction in financial services, but we did find that Luxembourg in European countries has actually lost as well. So a lot of discussions we have written in the paper, but in terms of financial services, which has drawn most of the interesting discussions, I think it's interesting to see that financial services did not lose overall over this period, which of course doesn't mean that it's not going to decline in the future. Now we see the last share trading center has moved to the Netherlands, and there are other things moving trends happening. But as you can see here, maybe the Brexit is not one-way street. So some European countries did run a loss, and we also find some growth in the Bermuda financial services as well. So there's some anecdotal evidence to suggest that some of the services has moved from the UK to Bermuda in order to help US companies to serve European countries in the future. Okay, so overall findings are here. I'm not going to repeat. And the other additional analysis we run was to run a slightly different methodology to look at how outside EU, UK trade to outside EU differ from the UK exports to EU. And to our surprise, we find that in terms of general trend of growth or decline, has not much difference between the two destinations in terms of growth trend. So this is really interesting to us because in a similar research we've done with goods, we found very strong, very consistent evidence to describe the UK trade diversion. So to the run-up to the real Brexit, UK companies have already introduced much more new products to outside EU than EU. We also see some evidence this morning. But for the services, we don't see that. Now the question is, why is that the case? Is it because there was nothing really happening over this period, so companies are holding on? That is clearly not the case for transport and travel and telecom and IP. So is it because there's limited markets to move towards outside the EU? Maybe, and that highlights the difficulty of expanding the services in the area where service trade liberalization is limited. And again, we find transport, travel, insurance, telecom the most affected one, and Ireland by far is the biggest winner. And the Netherlands experienced growth in business services, intellectual property, and there's no significant reduction in financial and services. Now, so given that we have learned this, I think Sarah will tell you a bit more about what's happening more recently and future. So what do we do with the dwindling trade? So this is one discussions I think could have plenty. So looking to the future, when I think about this, what can be done? There's so many discussions. There are so many discussions and telling us it is not quite possible to really liberalize services like in an easy way than goods, which is completely true. So what can UK firms do in the service front? When I think about this, I think about two things. Trading essentially are two things. One is a trader, one is a condition to trade. So the conditions to trade has deteriorated big time. And there's, it looks very bleak in order to improve that condition anytime soon in a significant way. But looking forward, there are areas that perhaps something can be done. So one area is to increase to find the possibilities to allow mobility of business travel, which is a big thing, and we hear plenty issues with business people coming here, fly in, fly out is not allowed, and therefore some of the head offices have to be set up in EU, in addition to other barriers which motivate such move. And the second area I think is holding the ground for the digital trade. I think there's a strong rationale to write digital trade terms or conditions in any kind of trade negotiation into the future. I think it's really important to embed that provision in any kind of future trade negotiations. And the third thing is that I think there's a difference between the trade in goods and in services. In goods, there's segmentation of the production, and we're thinking about the supply chain, we're thinking about just-in-time production. But for services, it is not clear what some economists consider fallback position. So some of the services is basically either you can do it or you can't do it. So what would be the fallback position? This is the first characteristics. Second characteristics is most of service sectors are embedded with a kind of ecosystem. It is not just one type of services and everything else will maintain the same if there is nothing changed. So it's basically all the different sectors like financial, accounting, architectural, engineering, and the legal services. These are all bundled in the network. We've done some network analysis in the past, and what we could see is in European network of services, UK financial services absolutely in the middle. But not far from that, you would see all sorts of other services I just mentioned in surrounding. So to provide and allow that network to be healthy and to provide that condition to allow this network to sustain and create more space, I think is absolutely crucial. And this leads to the kind of most important aspect of the production of services, which is human capital. I think now the skills problem are becoming even worse. well, I guess Jonathan will talk about this issue later on. I think for the UK looking forward, how to make this place more attractive for talents and maintaining talents will be quite crucial for services. And finally, I think looking forward, it is about making a long-term strategy. Long-term strategy, not necessarily in terms of trade negotiation agreements and going out. It's about government think about this long-term economic strategy and economic policy in a kind of coherent and joined-up way. To think about in the future what would bring grounds for that competitiveness condition. For example, Sarah does a lot of work in green finance. So looking into the future when the need of net zero transitioning becomes necessary, not just for UK, but for the whole world, to provide that fertile ground for the investment to coming through, for the investment to coming to invest the technologies to allow that happen will become much important. So here, one thing to mention is that if you compare UK and US, which are not really comparable, but nevertheless, it provides some kind of thinking. The US, the biggest service exports markets will be in every continent. In all the major countries, and their customers in the developing and emerging economies will be about a quarter. But if you look at the major customers of the UK in terms of service exports, most are in the EU, absolutely, and the flows to emerging and the BRICS countries are tiny, so literally less than 1 or 2 or 3%. So can UK do more in that ground? Of course, it's easier said than done because UK doesn't have that gravity, the size. So then for services, apart from size, is there anything else can make UK more attractive to increase the value of the proposition? Probably the obvious front is digitalization and new ideas. So this should be part of the thinking of the economic policy making looking forward. Okay, meanwhile, uncertainty continues. I would like to throw a few kind of observations. So we talk a lot about business relocation because, when UK becomes less attractive as a gateway to gateway to EU, then companies thinking about going somewhere else, and there's already work done. So we looked at, this is the OBIS data provided by BVD through the cross-border investment, and we wanted to look at where, when UK firms invest abroad, especially in EU, what do they invest? And the darker areas means more projects. Obviously, I have to give a warning. This is a very rough data. This is literally raw data. So this is all the counts of the projects invested to different space. And what we can see is from 2016, if you can imagine a line, there are some areas that UK firms invest much more abroad. For example, to go for the market access domestically, be that the Netherlands or the Ireland or Germany, and market access and domestic market potential. So UK firms are going broad in order to access to the UK. And at the same time, we identify the skilled worker availability is one of the key reasons the UK firms invest abroad. Does that mean that this similar issue in the UK will be one of the constraints for firms to consider investing here? Would firms, multinational from other countries investing here, be concerned of this constraint? So this is a clear one question we need to be looking into and being alerted to. So where do UK firms invest? The most popular places we hear so far is the Netherlands, France, and Ireland. But from this picture, we can show you that actually Germany is by far the most popular. And given the number of multinationals investing here are probably not just manufacturing, so this shows you some more nuances than just the relocation of production sites. And we see that Germany, Spain, Ireland, France, Netherlands, Poland, they're all popular places. Okay, so what about the money coming in? So this shows you the number of projects invested to the UK, and here we're interested in understanding what have brought these companies coming to the UK to invest. And what we can see, if you can imagine before 16 and after 16, what we can see is that the banking and finance, well, there were a lot of investment before, and there are slightly more, not significantly more. So we have seen a lot of anecdotal evidence that UK banks are moving their branches abroad. I think there's statistics suggest about 10% of all banks are moving their assets to European countries. But certainly you will see that investment coming to the UK as well. So the picture is more nuanced than just a business relocated away. And similarly, we see that the business services are getting more. So when we suspect the business professional services competitiveness is declining, there's certainly investment coming to the UK to invest as well. And then I think the technical, this is one of the striking ones. So there's much more investment coming to the UK to invest in the technical capability and the technical companies. So I think this is certainly one of the areas there might be some opportunities to grow and hold on to market. But finally, I want to draw your attention to the manufacturing. And what you observe is that before 2016, there were much more investment to coming here to produce. And that certainly has declined. So I think this is beyond the service discussion, but it's nevertheless very important because we all know that in manufacturing sectors, the jobs are highly paid, there's knowledge spillover, and there's all sorts of other benefits. And it's important to, especially to the areas which are not prosperous enough and not resilient enough. So certainly Brexit seems to reduce the attractiveness of UK as investment place for manufacturing sites. Okay, so I'll stop here. Comments are welcome. Thanks.
Thank you so much, June, for giving us a very comprehensive picture of what's been happening up until 2019. I also think it sort of gives light to the fact that you hear a lot that because the single market in services in the EU is one of the least developed parts of the single market, that there's not so much to lose. Clearly, that's not the case. Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you, and maybe you can give us a sense of what is going to happen perhaps in the future and some of the other contexts around trade and services. Sarah Hall from the University of Nottingham and also a member of UK Changing in Europe. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. So what I want to do is look at financial services in more detail, and this builds quite nicely actually on some of the comments that Yun has made. I was really inspired by the call for the conference, which kind of asked us to think about what we know and also what we don't know and where future uncertainties lie. And that's very much what I think we have to do with financial services, where I would argue we're still in the early stages of understanding what Brexit and the UK's new trading relationship with the EU means. And in fact, the presentation follows so nicely from Yun that I don't really need to go through this slide. Just to note again that the UK is a services economy. I think it's crucial to stress that it's a services economy that is very strong on trade. So the UK has typically run a surplus in services, which has allowed us to buy the goods that we import. The TCA makes services trade between the UK and the EU, particularly exports from the UK to the EU, more difficult. And if you're interested in that more generally for the service sector, I'd just like to draw your attention to a recent report that looked at it at the sector level more generally. So within that wider context then, I think it's important to note that the EU in particular was an important export market for UK services. So over a longer time period, as shown in this chart, whilst goods exports to the EU, from the UK fell slightly, whilst the UK was a member state, services exports remained largely stable. As Yun has also headlined, one of the real challenges of doing research on services trade is access to data. UK official data sources on services trade are not as robust or as detailed as those for goods. And so in the paper and in this presentation, I'll be using a variety of data sources, including, dare I say it, qualitative research, where we've done in-depth interviews with firms operating in the UK market. But before we delve into some of that detail, this chart uses ONS data to show you the changing relative importance or composition of UK services exports between 2019 and 2021. Given this was at the height of the COVID pandemic and associated lockdowns, I don't think it's surprising to see that travel and transport, both to non-EU and EU 27 countries, fell significantly. But there does seem to be something interesting going on with financial services in this data. So even if the overall financial services position for the UK has not been as bad as some of the worst case estimates would suggest in terms of Brexit, which Yun signalled and which I would agree with, I think there is something interesting going on in terms of the composition. This chart is suggesting quite significant declines in the relative importance of the EU, with some of that being offset by growth internationally. I think it's also important to note that services haven't fared as well in recent years as goods more generally. And when you look at the UK position post-COVID, if we can say that, and also post-Brexit. So exports to the EU and non-EU countries have declined in services since 2019. And there's something very interesting going on with EU imports shown on the chart on the right-hand side. I think this is picking up some of the interesting figures that we've already heard about for goods. I think it's important, though, to kind of situate the impact of Brexit, which we also have to be cognizant of how that's played out through COVID, within longer-run changes when we think about financial services. So the common story is that London was an international financial centre, and during the period of EU membership, it kind of further cemented that position by acting as an entry post, as Yun suggested, for firms seeking to enter the EU single market through passporting. That's undoubtedly true, but I think this, over a sort of longer time period, you can see that London's dominance as a financial centre perhaps was already diminishing prior to Brexit, or at least London was facing growing competition from European financial centres. So this chart does come with some caveats in that it's quite hard to sort of accurately measure competitiveness of financial centres. This is using one data set, which is a kind of 6-monthly survey conducted by a consultancy firm that uses a number of measures that it ranks the competitiveness of financial centres on, and that includes things like labour market availability, business environment, infrastructure environment, regulatory openness, etc. The data here is shown from 2007 to 2022, and you can see a trend here of growing competition from European financial centres that predates Brexit. We've heard a lot about this since Brexit. I think as well it's also important to note a global trend within financial services. So here this is using the same data, but it's taking the top 5 financial centres from each world region and charting those from 2007 to 2022. There's been quite a lot written post-Brexit about whether for financial services Europe as a whole may lose out, particularly to the Asia-Pacific region. Sorry, I found that very hard to say. And again, I think it's just important to locate that within a longer run, pre-Brexit, pre-COVID set of trends. The kind of broad analysis that, as researchers, we take from this is that London and New York have had dominance as financial centres for a number of years, decades in fact, but they have faced growing competition from different emerging markets, both within Europe but also globally. So it's within that context then that the UK financial services sector left the EU. And I'm going to turn to the details of that departure now. So when we talk about services, I think it's really important to be clear about what Brexit is about, because it's about rather different things to what trading goods is about. So goods as we heard fantastically this morning, is about tariffs, quotas, and goods physically crossing borders. For services, the issues are different, and it's really a question of who or what is regulated and authorised to sell services into a particular region and to which customers. So the question of regulatory alignment or not features very heavily. As Mehreen just mentioned, the EU single market did go further than is typical for trade areas in services, does go further. And the UK took advantage of this through passporting rights, which allowed London to act as this base through which firms could service the EU market. It was clear that passporting wasn't going to continue, and the UK financial services sector are now accessing the EU single market through equivalence determinations. And here I think it's important to stress that this isn't a like-for-like replacement. So equivalence, as set out by the EU, is temporary, it can be revoked, and it acts in particular domains. And the chart on your right shows the EU equivalence decisions which were made at the point of departure. The UK was granted 2, and there's currently 1 in play, which relates to clearing activities. The UK also made its own equivalence decisions on departing the EU, and has taken a rather different approach, has been much more liberal in terms of market access. And the UK also implemented a temporary permissions regime. I won't go through the complexities of that, but it essentially meant that firms that gave prior notice that were operating in the UK at the point of departure could continue to do so. And I think that the UK equivalence approach and the temporary permissions regime may be part of the reason why Yun is right to say that we should look at financial services firms coming into London, not just the challenges that UK firms have faced exporting to the EU. So in terms of what Brexit meant for financial services, the first then is a loss of passporting rights and the movement to a limited set of equivalence decisions. The TCA was accompanied by an ambition to agree a memorandum of understanding on regulatory cooperation, and that hasn't currently been signed. And Boris Johnson is on the record as saying that the TCA perhaps doesn't go as far as we would like for financial services. And it's for these reasons that I think it's fair to argue that Brexit has been relatively hard for financial services. To get to that position, there's a long story. I think the key point is to note that certainly in the early stages of the Brexit negotiations, the government was asking for greater market access than the UK currently has, and there were various different forms of market access, a sort of permanent equivalence, a model, or a form of mutual recognition circulating, but these were dropped over the course of the negotiating period. So in a way then we're in something of a conundrum in that financial services has seen a harder Brexit than the UK was negotiating for at least initially, harder Brexit than perhaps for in other sectors, but the impacts perhaps haven't been as notable so far as they have been for other sectors. And I think this is partly a reflection of the fact that what Brexit means for financial services, it differs quite significantly depending on the part of the financial services sector that you're looking at. So what it means for banking is very different to what it means for asset management. And indeed, different parts of the financial services sector had different asks in the run-up to the signing of the TCA. And these differences have come out really clearly in in-depth interview work that we've done, and which is reported in the paper with firms. So, this interviewee was really clear, and this supports research out there, that for some parts of financial services, talking here about share trading, the impact of Brexit without equivalent was binary and very negative. You could do something legally in the UK whilst the UK was a member state, and you couldn't do that on the 4th of January 2021, so it wasn't surprising that adjustments were made. I think the key point here, though, is that there are other parts of financial services which aren't as binary, and it's there where continued uncertainty lies. So I draw attention to here, so something like asset management and questions about the amount of activity that needs to take place within the EU within asset management is still an area of quite significant debate. So what do we know then, returning to the point I made at the start, what do we know about what has happened to UK financial services? I should say here, and the observant ones among you might have noticed that I'm a professor of economic geography, and that doesn't mean I colour in a lot of the time. But it does mean that I'm quite committed to understanding the spatial impacts of Brexit. And here I'm talking about European centres. I think one area we don't know very much about, and I think it would be prudent to know more about, is the impact of Brexit on financial services across regional financial hubs in the UK, particularly somewhere like Edinburgh that has a really significant asset management sector and is going to be impacted. But if we turn to the European picture, the job relocations have largely been lower than worst case estimates suggested. New Financial, which are the figures I'm quoting here, are estimating around 7,500 jobs. The EY Brexit tracker would be another source of information, and their most latest data that came out about a month ago was further revised down to around 7,000 jobs. It's a picture of fragmentation rather than a story of one city dominating. I think there's some really interesting evidence when you dig down into this data about the kind of functional specialisation which is emerging in these places. So Amsterdam dominating in market infrastructure relocations, for example, Frankfurt in banking. The notable exception here is Paris, which I think is really interesting, which has more of a range of financial services activity relocating there, but typically of lower value or more mid to back office activity. So there's something interesting going on there, shown here as a kind of secondary move rather than hub. But we haven't seen a kind of overall erosion or hemorrhaging of jobs from the UK. These are job figures in financial services across all European countries. So we're seeing continued importance relatively in the UK compared to other European states, And I just think it's worth noting that that kind of fragmentation is not unusual. So the US, for example, has a fragmented financial services sector. London, in some ways, is quite unusual for the way in which it's dominated Europe. And the US picture obviously reflects the fact that all these financial services centres, so kind of tech finance in California, some sort of back office work in Delaware, for example, that's obviously all within one trading block, and that's what's different about the situation in Europe currently, in that London remains Europe's dominant financial centre, but is outside EU regulatory control. So if we think about what we don't know so much about and where we might be heading, I said earlier on that one of the key questions for financial services and services more generally in terms of trade relates to regulation. And this is particularly the case in financial services. So as the UK is operating outside of the EU and with only one equivalence decision, the Brexit dividend there potentially lies in what the UK chooses to do with its newfound sovereignty of UK financial services regulatory reform. And you do see this quite clearly, I think, in something like the Tigger report, which identifies financial services as being a key area for regulatory change. Since Brexit, the UK has been active in terms of setting out what regulatory changes might, and indeed in some cases have been made, and there's been around 30 consultations and reviews announced. One of the kind of most significant of these is the Future Regulatory Framework Review, which essentially looks to set out the UK's approach to regulation outside of the EU and also how it's going to deal with EU legislation which it onshored. So there's kind of general regulatory changes such as that, and then there's more sector-specific things like the Solvency II review for insurance, the Khalifa review on fintech, the Lord Hill review on listings. So I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of activity from the UK in terms of regulatory changes, but I think it might also be fair to say that there's been more activity than there has been implementation. So in this table, I went through some of the main regulatory views and updated their status and implementation. And whilst there's been a lot of activity and ambition set out, in terms of implementation, I think you could argue that it's been slower. And a number of changes are scheduled when, and I quote, when parliamentary time allows. And there's some evidence that the sector is starting to become quite vocal about the time in which these changes are being implemented. I think there may also be a question here, and this picks up on Yun's point about what the overall ambition and strategy is for UK financial services, which is articulated by the Treasury in particular around being internationally open and competitive, with a focus on areas such as green finance and fintech. But beyond that, I think a kind of overall strategy may be less clear. There are further sources of uncertainty. Some of these come from regulatory changes which are being made within the EU. So the ECB is conducting a desk mapping review at the moment, which is assessing the extent to which financial services activity needs to be located within the EU. There's one outstanding equivalence decision which has been extended again to 2025, which relates to clearing. But that's not certain, and so we'll need to watch closely in terms of what happens at the end of that. And I think also, crucially, how the UK positions financial services within its new trading relationships with international parties is important. So historically, free trade agreements typically don't do much for services and don't do much for financial services. But the UK is negotiating quite an innovative mutual recognition agreement with Switzerland currently, which the Treasury has now said on the record could be used as a template for agreements with other third countries. So I think that's interesting in terms of how Brexit may be used to innovate around what trade agreements could or perhaps should do for services. So where do I think we are then in terms of post-Brexit financial services trade? We've seen a hard Brexit for financial services, but lower job relocations out of the UK than perhaps were predicted. There's also been some evidence of activity moving onshore within the UK. At the same time, there's evidence of fragmentation of financial services activity between the UK and the EU and also within Europe. And there may be some costs associated with that for businesses, particularly around clearing. But I think the key point to emphasise is that we're in the very early stages of Brexit for financial services, and there are a number of ongoing uncertainties. So the Bank of England has been clear that they think we're only in the early stages of understanding the jobs picture for financial services, for example. There's a number of regulatory changes in train, but they're progressing relatively slowly. And we don't know what the impact of new trade agreements and new types of trade agreements might be. Particularly, I would draw attention to the MRA with Switzerland. I'd also emphasise that the picture around jobs is further complicated by the COVID impact. And so I would very much agree with Yun that kind of the mobility of people to deliver services has been central. There seems to be evidence of ongoing hybrid working, but the importance of face-to-face delivery remains. And so changes around migration, but also I would stress short-term business mobility is an area that I think is yet to be fully worked out. And this all comes within a caveat that there are real data challenges in studying services trade, despite it being a really central plank of the UK economy. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to take them on Slido, but because I can see a hand, if you can shout, because I don't think we have mics, and just tell us your name.
I wanted to take us back to something which Adam Posen said earlier on today when he was talking about where should this country be going. And he said one of the things you need to concentrate upon is your role, this country's role as an education provider. Now, education is a service, and I didn't see very much mention that was actually being made of it. It's actually a service which probably quite a lot of these people in this room are somehow also involved in one way or another. What we do know about education as a service, most of the things we seem to know about actually have as much to do with external factors, some of those other things we talked about today, like the segmentation of the world into blocks, which means maybe where are those students from who used to come from China going to be, what are they going to be replaced by? Maybe by the effect of the war in Ukraine, and where are those Russians and others who are filling up some of our universities and some of our public schools, where are they going to be replaced by? But there has also been an impact upon education services through interventions in what used to be the European Horizon programme, the role that this country played in that, and also the arrangements that are supposed to follow things like Erasmus. So I wondered whether we could comment upon educational services as well. What has Brexit done or not done for them? And I was slightly surprised that nobody even mentioned this. Thank you.
Do you want to take that one?
Anything I say is not based on statistical analysis, which makes me feel uneased. But nevertheless, I'm from university, but in the last few years, we had overflow of applicants from China particularly, but from other places as well, especially given the environment of the kind of relationship between China and Australia. China and US has worsened. I think from university point of view, we are losing students from EU areas, but students from China has been quite a lot. So coming back to what Adam said, I think I'm totally in agreement with that. Coming back to this ability and the gravity to do any negotiation, you've got to be big enough. That's one of the reasons the UK hasn't really gained much ground in the way that US would gain in the kind of trade negotiations in terms of services. So I think the arguments to say that you've got to cling on someone's beak, it can be said more nicely, but I think it's just facts. And whom you want to be friend with is the question. Certainly, EU is area you want to be friend with. Therefore, further trade, whatever you call it, dialogue, conversation, to amend the relationship, to rebuild that trust, to find common grounds to do more is certainly one of the no-brainers. At the same time, making friends with US is always there, but there's limited thing can do. And then with Japan, I think that the recent trade agreement with Japan has laid out the grounds where we can do more on the digital side of digital trade. I think that presented some examples we can do with others. But at the same time, how much you want to go to alienate China? Obviously, I look Chinese, I guess. So I don't think UK want to be very hostile with China for multiple reasons. Of course, at some point, you need to be choosing. But but China is by far a very, very large country, and it supplies a lot of things, more than students. So I believe if you look at the trade statistics, UK and China statistics are very meager. So there are a lot of grounds one can open to do more, without really going too much into politics. But that's only an economist's view.
Thank you. We have 3 questions about Ireland, which I'm just going to combine. They're basically asking why Ireland has seen an uptick. I think it was 0.8% in your graphs, Yoon. Where that is coming from, whether it's head office relocation, and somebody else asked, is it a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol that Ireland seems to be a winner, but maybe not as big a winner as some might have expected beforehand? And Sarah, maybe you could talk about where Ireland might be gaining in terms of the different aspects of financial services.
This was one of the questions we really scratched our head, and we had a very hard interview with FT editor to explain. I think there are a couple of things. These results are based on the kind of causal analysis we've done. So if we could believe such analysis which isolate the causal impact of Brexit, which, can be 100% or 60%, based on econometric analysis, this is what we believe, but there might be other things going on. But from our point of view, when we think about why this has happened, I think there are a couple of things. One is trade itself. You're thinking about why Brexit, even before Brexit happened, could have an impact on trade. There are various studies in the literature explaining why. One of the main factors is uncertainty. With uncertainty, firms stop or decline or slow down investment. This is investment for all sorts of things: innovation, investing in a factory, investing a sales agency in a place. So it's not just a production, it's services as well. So with the slowing down services, slowing down the kind of investment, trade declines. This is one channel. The other channel, which we learn from the trade in goods literature, is that over this period, even before Brexit, the cost of trade is not just real cost, is opportunity cost of trading, which firms could do something else with other people outside EU, declined. So this is the literature of trade destruction and trade diversion of goods during this period, which evidence is very clear. So it could be in the same way happen with services as well. So where this result could be driven by both the declining trade per se, and also the declining of traders. And the traders did not stop trading, but it changed location. And one of the popular places in Ireland, although to really pin down to this evidence, you need to look into individual firm-level analysis to really understanding how that allocation of subsidiaries and multinationals have changed because of Brexit. Is that on jobs?
Yeah, so on financial services in Ireland, there's really clear evidence of quite significant growth in asset management, in particular in Ireland. And that's largely or frequently attributed to Ireland's tax system, and particularly its corporate tax rates. I think the kind of two other points I'd make in relation to financial services in Ireland. One is around the question of mobility. I think it's quite important to mention the common travel area between Ireland and the UK. And also, so I was speaking with businesses in Dublin a couple of weeks ago. And bear in mind, I live in the East Midlands, which is not known for its booming financial services economy. So I was quite struck by the extent to which they were speaking as if they were in a bubble, and that capacity, they were really struggling for capacity. So, for example, law firms losing lawyers from Dublin to London because the pay was higher in London because of shortages in London, but also some concerns, I think, starting to emerge about office space cost in Dublin, and potentially some really interesting outcomes of that around financial services FDI into Northern Ireland. So there's a really interesting phenomenon taking place where there's quite significant FDI, particularly from US firms, into fintech and insurtech around Belfast. So the growth of those kinds of activities on the island of Ireland, I think, is something really interesting to watch.
That's very interesting. I think I'm going to take two more. I've got one in a room and I'll take one from Slido. It's the gentleman at the back.
Yes, I was quite despondent when we cancelled international trade support recently, but I'm quite buoyed up by the fact that we've now been so magnanimous by giving all of our trade to the rest of the world. So some good news there. Now, I think you've both said that much of this is yet to come, so we don't know for various reasons what's to come. Some of it's baked in. So just a view from both of you on whether we foresee these effects to be continuous and level, going linear essentially, or just unpredictable and sort of unknown into the future.
I think that would be a good one to end on. And I'll take one from Slido as well, from Stephen Boxall, who asks, if we look at the number of people employed in services in the UK, have the numbers changed as much as the change in the value of the services? I don't know if either of you are able to speak to that point. The number of people employed in services, I guess between 2016 up until now, has it changed as much as the volume of trade in services? Has there been any kind of compositional effect on employment levels?
Right, they're two absolutely huge questions. So on the kind of general trend, the data I see at the moment suggests kind of relative flatlining in financial services in the immediate term, I would say. But I think I do have to caveat that with quite a number of uncertainties, both in terms of things that haven't been worked out fully yet in terms of Brexit impacts, but also on the other side of the coin, what kind of future changes may bring, particularly in terms of growth with new markets. On the compositional effects on the labour market, I don't have that data to hand, but I think the sort of bifurcated nature of the services labour market is really interesting and important, and quite a striking element, I think, of the UK labour market. But what they both seem to share is potential shortages in labour market talent currently, which I think is quite striking, because often we talk about the kind of low-paid end of the service sector market quite separately from the kind of high-skilled financial services, legal services side. But there seems to be some interesting trends around labour shortages in both of those from the data I've seen, which is quite striking, I think.
Do you want to have the last word on what happens now?
Thanks, Mehreen. I don't know any job labour figure, so I'm sorry, I can't really comment on that. As for the future, I think for services, it's important to see what's going to happen with the equivalence. That is number one. Number two is what's going to happen in the medium term in terms of agreements with trade, with the free flow of data. I think these two could be kind of very detrimental issue if things don't go in the right way. I worry about the skills because there are a lot of evidence to suggest that the skill problem is really a huge issue. It's always an issue for the UK. It's not new, but it's getting worse. And if you think about, when you think about trading, we all know from literature that productive firms trade, productive sectors trade, productive nations trade more. So it's all about productivity. And when we talk about productivity, what do we mean? We mean you can produce something or service something cheaper or better in a given inputs. So with services as well, given the condition of the trading is the same, it's about how competitive these firms are. But then, if you have seen the kind of distribution of productivity at the firm level for the whole UK, the what's so-called UK productivity problem is really the long, fat tail at the end. And who are these less productive and really non-performing firms? Probably are the small and not necessarily young and not probably old. These firms a lot of them are in services. So they are not productive. And it's already very selective. We know that very, very tiny proportion of firms trade for goods and even more so for services. So in the long run, things are getting more expensive and human capital is more expensive. And even worse, you can't even find human capital. And how would you do innovation? How do you implement digitalization? How would you think about net zero transition? How do you have the capacity to invest? And how do you invest in management quality, which is a huge issue, and leadership? So all these surrounding issues which would determine the productivity of firms will be the key to hold the future. So that's what I
It's quite grim. Thank you very much. To end on that note, my final job is to say thank you to both the speakers, and I think we're heading for a break, so you guys can go and stretch your legs for a little bit. But thank you very much.